Welcome to Holy Kool-Aid Live. Today I am joined by a very special guest, Tim O'Neill from the History for Atheists blog. Tim has a passion for figuring out whether or not something is historical or not and trying to figure out what actually happened in the past. He studied history and literature, specifically focusing on historical analysis at the University of Tasmania, where he also got a master's degree in medieval literature. Now, Tim, I want you to share with us a little bit why you started the blog History for Atheists and why you, as an atheist, are correcting other common, misconceptions by fellow atheists. Because if I'm not mistaken, you've been on the skeptic side of the fence for decades now, and you were even a leading member of, was it Australian Skeptics? And
Yeah, I was a state president of the Australian Skeptics. That was quite a while ago. But yeah, I'm an atheist, I'm a skeptic. But it's a fair question because even though we atheists are meant to be rationalists and we're meant to welcome, criticism and correction, that's all very well in theory. But what I actually find is that unfortunately we can be as tribal as many religious people. So I do get some people getting quite agitated with me about the fact that I'm critiquing atheists. I'm not critiquing all atheists. I'm just critiquing ones who make errors. I find pretty major errors about history. And I've recently had an exchange on Twitter with someone who was sort of saying, "Well, you're helping the enemy." And my response to that is, well, first of all, I'm not an atheist activist. I frankly don't really have too much of a problem with people who are religious. Maybe it's because I live in a very secular country, but so I don't see believers as the enemy. I might disagree with them, but I'm not like in some kind of warfare with them. And secondly, if you don't like me pointing out problems that with some atheists' conceptions of history, then they need to get better at history. But yeah, that's you're shooting the messenger, buddy. So why did I start History for Atheists? Well, it actually began as a way of saving myself time. Back in the early 2000s, I'd noticed the rise of what's still sometimes referred to as the new atheists. So Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, and so on. And as someone who's been an atheist all my life, I kind of found this quite interesting. Suddenly atheism was a bit cool. Never been cool before. It always been kind of dorky. So I began following a lot of discussion forums and blogs, and then when YouTube popped up, video channels on atheism. And what I found was that a lot of the arguments that were being used were not actually philosophical, scientific, or even theological arguments against belief in God and various religious beliefs. They were historical. And some of them, many of them actually, were based on a extremely simplistic, kind of childish and actually highly outdated, largely 18th or 19th century conception of history, and also were based on some common misconceptions about history. So these are not unique to atheist activists, but they're quite widely understood. But unfortunately, these were many of them quite prominent and highly educated and highly intelligent atheists who were simply assuming that these 19th century myths were correct and were basing arguments on them. So I started to work to kind of debunk some of these forums. I found that I was debunking the same stuff over and over again, and I got a bit bored with that. So what I started doing was I started a blog, and the blog was basically so I could write reasonably lengthy, quite comprehensive articles, drawing on the work of leading historians and scholars, because I don't pretend to be a scholar myself, but curating the consensus of historical scholarship and showing how a lot of these ideas on which some of these arguments were based were actually wrong, or were misconceptions, or were simplistic, or were complete myths. So that's sort of how it started. It was basically to save myself time, so I wasn't having to repeat myself. That hasn't worked because I'm now having to. I've got an audience. I'm writing usually a 7,000 to 10,000 word article every month, and I've also started a video channel and a podcast. So much. Oh yeah. Yeah, I do that too. And I've got, a reasonably growing Twitter following and so on as well. So it keeps me pretty busy. But the upside of it is I am having some kind of impact. I'm increasingly getting people saying, well, actually, I thought that before, but now I've changed my mind. Well, that's always nice to see. You get dogmatic dickheads who wouldn't change their mind anyway. And unfortunately, we have our share of those on the atheist side of the fence as much as there is on the religious side. They're pretty easy to ignore.
Yeah, and I was raised in the Christian side of the fence, the very fundamentalist Christian side of the fence, and because I had more of a young Earth creationist background, a lot of the things that I was taught about history were very biblically literalistic. Everything in Genesis is correct. The Earth is 6,000 years old, and obviously that's not historical. So
Yeah.
it's very easy and very natural to want to just throw it all out and push back and stuff and say, like, obviously because certain stories, Adam and Eve didn't happen and the flood didn't happen, therefore there's no kernel of truth. But oftentimes there is, and half the fun of exploring this and really diving through the literature and looking at the archaeological finds is figuring out what is the distant memory that some of these texts are based off of. How much of it is true and how much of it isn't, and how much can the Bible inform our discoveries.
Yeah.
But Tim, I want to walk through some of the posts on your blog. Obviously, we don't have time to go through all of them today because, like you said, there's a lot, and they're quite extensive, long posts. But there's a few that I've picked out that I think are common myths that a lot of atheists have fallen for. There's some things that I've repeated before in the past, and I want to dive into them and maybe push back a little or get your take on them. And
Sure.
the first one that I really want to cover is the idea that Hitler was a Christian. We often hear people say, oh, Hitler was an atheist. He's an example of, how atheism leads to these horrible atrocities. And atheists will push back and say, actually, Hitler was a Christian. And they point to, various things. The Nazis had God with us on their belt. And, Hitler's first treaty, was with the Vatican and all these things. How do you show that Hitler wasn't a Christian? Like, where are you getting that from when it seems like he was very connected with the church and would attend services and talk about his belief in God?
Sure. The idea, the thing about Hitler is that he's a lightning rod for discussion about good and evil, because he's now
nobody wants him.
So the Christians don't want him. Obviously, we don't want him either. Yeah. So first of all, was Hitler an atheist? Hell no, he definitely wasn't, and that is absolutely clear. He referred to atheism as being a return to the level of the animal. He rejected atheism quite vehemently. He shut down atheist and free thinker groups in Germany when he came to power. So he despised atheism. He thought atheism was completely wrong, and he was completely consistent in both his public and his private conversations, his public speeches and proclamations and his private conversations, that he believed in God. Now, his conception of God was, like many of his ideas, odd, often incoherent, and quite difficult to pin down. He often referred to God as providence. He seems to have had a fairly sort of abstract idea of God in some ways, but in other ways he makes comments that sees God very much as a distinct person. But was he an atheist? Hell no, that's completely wrong. So the Christians who try and claim that are completely wrong. Was he a Christian? Well, no. But here's where things get complicated, because I just mentioned his public pronouncements and his private comments. People often point to public pronouncements that Hitler made that seem to indicate that he, or seem to state that he was actually a Christian. So in 1922, he made a very clear statement where he seemed to be saying, well, as a Christian, my feeling as a Christian points me to my Lord and Saviour, that's Jesus, as a fighter. He points me to the man who, once in loneliness, surrounded by a few followers, recognized these Jews for what they were and summoned men to fight against them. So this is in a speech that he gave April 12, 1922. And people often take that. I've seen Dawkins, for example, take that purely at face value and say, look, he says he's a Christian. He refers to Jesus as his Lord and Saviour. And so therefore he's a Christian. The problem with that is twofold. First of all, that speech was made in a very particular context, and not just a particular political context, but it was actually a response to a speech that had been made not long before by a leader of the opposition party that was basically saying the Nazi party is evil, it's anti-Christian because it's anti-Semitic. And so the leader of the opposition party in Bavaria was saying, as a Christian, I could not be a supporter of the Nazis because they're anti-Semites and that's evil and that's contrary to my Christian beliefs. So Hitler was responding to that and was saying, right, well, back at you. As a Christian, I see Jesus as an anti-Semitic fighter against the Jews. So he was twisting it around. The problem with taking this at face value as him actually being straight up when he says as a Christian is that pretty much everything else we know about Hitler indicates that he wasn't a Christian. He actually wasn't much of a fan of Christianity at all, and he certainly saw the churches in general, but particularly the Catholic Church, as being opposed to the Nazi ideology, and the Catholic Church saw things the same way. Protestant churches were a little more ambivalent about dancing with the Nazis a bit. But was he a Christian? If we go through all of the statements that we have from him about what he believed and compare them to the fundamental tenets of what we generally regard as Christian belief, he doesn't appear to have held any of them. So he doesn't believe that Jesus was God. He believed that Jesus was a great man. He also believed that Jesus wasn't a Jew, which is weird, but it was a common belief in Germany at that time. And he believed that Jesus was actually an anti-Semite. He sees Jesus as someone who tried but failed, and he actually saw himself as taking up the mantle of that anti-Semitic struggle that he saw Jesus having. So he certainly has some very weird ideas about Jesus, but none of them actually involve Jesus being God, let alone being the Messiah. And he didn't believe in the afterlife, though he had some garbled, many of his ideas were pretty incoherent. So he had some idea of he seemed to have some idea about an afterlife. He certainly didn't believe in heaven, hell, and purgatory. He poured scorn on that. And he didn't believe that Jesus was died on the cross to save us. He saw Jesus' death on the cross as a failure. And he basically didn't believe in anything that we could say is a coherent Christian belief. So to say he was a Christian, well, no. And I can't think of any historians who actually say he was a Christian. It seems to be something that just kind of gets thrown around. But if you actually look at the evidence is pretty clear that he most certainly wasn't. And as I said, there was a core of Christian Christians within the resistance against Nazi Germany, in Germany and elsewhere in occupied Europe.
It kind of reminds me of a lot of the countries in Europe where you might have on your birth certificate that you are a Catholic or you are, a Protestant or Church of England or something, and you'll have a religious identification that you might publicly say, oh yeah, I'm a part of this, but you don't necessarily believe any of it. And if you ask people in surveys, where do they believe in God? Do they think miracles happen? That they say no, but on paper they're Christian. And it sounds like Hitler took it to another level where he used it for political expediency. And he wasn't an atheist. He believed in God, like you were saying, but it's always really hard to parse apart, what someone identifies as publicly versus what they actually believe. And
that's very much the case with Hitler. I mean, one of the things we've got to remember about Hitler is that he was a great liar. He was a consummate liar. He was a brilliant politician, and politicians are very much about manipulating the truth. And if we look at the statements, because there's more than the one in 1922, but most of the statements that he makes, it kind of sounds a bit like him being nice about Christianity. They're kind of, if you look at the language, he's being very careful about not actually kind of lying outright and saying that he definitely does believe this stuff. He just says nice things about it. And if you also look at the dates on these statements, they tend to date from, like that one, 1922, but they particularly ramp up from about 1923 to 1933. And this was the period in which Hitler was trying to win power at the ballot box. So in 1923, he'd tried a military coup. He tried what's called the beer hall Stutsch, which was an attempt to actually overthrow the government of Bavaria, excuse me, by force. And it failed. And he ended up going to jail. Not very long, but in jail he realised he needed to change tactics. And so that's where he wrote Mein Kampf, which does have very, very clear statements about his belief in God and some slightly weaselly statements about Christianity. And that's where he formulated a way in which Nazi ideology and Christianity could kind of get along. So they came up with this idea of what they call positive Christianity, which was kind of like Christian belief, but with a Nazi spin. It wasn't actually a form of Christianity, but it was a way in which Christians, both Catholics and Protestants, could kind of reconcile Nazi ideology with their religious beliefs. He also worked very hard to try and win over voters, particularly in the parts of Germany where he was not, because he had a series of elections in that 10 years, where he was not winning good votes. And where he really wasn't winning votes was in the Catholic parts of the country. So his native Bavaria, which was his adopted part of Germany, and the Western Rhineland and various other parts of Germany that were predominantly Catholic. That's where he wasn't getting votes. So he was trying very hard to win those votes. In the end, he eventually kind of won power in 1933. And then we see all of those sorts of conciliatory statements towards Christianity tailing off. But the other piece of evidence that we need to look at is what were people saying about his beliefs, people who knew him, and what did he say in private? Now, the problem about what did he say in private is that that's all filtered through recollections of some of his henchmen. So there's some problems with some of that evidence. Some of it is vehemently anti-Christian, but we have to be a little bit careful, because some of the people that we were getting that info from were also vehemently anti-Christian. But people who knew him well referred to him as not being a Christian, and they stated it quite matter-of-factly. So I think, the evidence is overwhelming. He was not a Christian. And his mum was a Catholic, but his father was kind of an atheist, was a bit of a free thinker. And his father seems to have influenced his religious beliefs more than his mum. He stopped going to church when he was 17. He got confirmed in the Catholic Church, but his childhood friend said that it was with great reluctance, and he did it largely to keep his mum happy. So, no, not a Christian.
Well, and the thing is that us as atheists, we don't need to rely on that. We don't need to rely on misinformation to push back. When people say, oh, well, Hitler was an atheist or something, we don't need to say, no, he was a Christian. Obviously, he wasn't an atheist. But even when they push back with, well, what about Mao or Stalin or other people who were atheists? It's like, well, are those the only atheists you know? Because a lot of the people who pushed back against Hitler were themselves atheists. There's or against the Soviet Union were also atheists. You look at the writings of Bertrand Russell and Victor Serge and even George Orwell, was very, very anti-authoritarianism, and they were all atheists. And so it's like there's, with all of the millions of atheists who are in favor of freedom and pushing back against this horrible, awful, authoritarian atrocity that is Nazism and this violent form of authoritarian communism. It's like we don't have to resort to twisting history or twisting the truth in order to be able to respond to this type of stuff.
Absolutely.
The next thing, though, that I want to cover actually is a segue off of this, and it's that even if Hitler himself wasn't an atheist or a Christian, there's this idea that the Pope and the Catholic Church supported Hitler and the Nazis. So even if he's doing it for political means, there's this idea among atheists that they kind of buddied up to Hitler, and that the Pope was pro-Nazi and pro-Hitler.
Yeah.
Where's the truth stand on this?
Okay, this one again is quite complicated, but the idea that the papacy during the Second World War was pro-Nazi has been pushed pretty hard by Christopher Hitchens. So anyone who's read God Is Not Great, he has quite a dense paragraph where he claims that Pope Pius XII was pro-Nazi. Where he says,
it didn't originate with him. There's, it goes back to Hitler's Pope and before.
No, it didn't. And you're right. He bases pretty much everything in that paragraph on a book by John Cornwell from 1999 called Hitler's Pope. The problem is Cornwell wasn't a historian. He was a journalist. And he has since, after a lot of criticism of what he claimed in Hitler's Pope, he has since pretty much retracted and admitted a lot of what he claimed, and admitted that actually he didn't really present things in a highly objective way. But that hasn't stopped people running with the idea of Pius XII as Hitler's Pope. So Hitchens says that the very first treaty agreed, I think you mentioned this before, Thomas, agreed by the Nazi regime was with the papacy. That was the Concordat of 1933. And he then quotes the greetings that Pius XII gave to Adolf Hitler on his accession to the chancellorship. So he makes out that they were very, very cosy. He says that the Concordat between the papacy and the Nazi regime silenced Catholics from making any kind of political criticism of the Nazi regime, and also shut down the Centre Party, which was the main opposition party standing in the way of the Nazis in their early years. Every single one of those statements is wrong, like factually wrong. So it was not the first treaty that was agreed by the Nazis. There were two others before it. It was one of the first, but that's factually wrong. More importantly, though, he paints the idea of a concordat, which is a special kind of treaty between the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and a political regime, as being some kind of friendly, happy sort of a treaty. Concordats are actually ways in which the Catholic Church finds a way to negotiate diplomatically with a hostile regime. And if you look at the background to the Concordat, it was not one of friendly, happy, partnership. It was one of conflict. The Nazi regime was very much heirs to what was called the Kulturkampf, the culture war, and this was the Prussian regimes back in the 19th century attempt to completely constrain, constrict, and choke any kind of political power that the Catholic Church might have had in the fledgling German Federation. The Catholic Church was paranoid that Kulturkampf was going to be revived by the Nazis, and the Nazis were giving them every indication that was what was going to happen. They were shutting down Catholic newspapers, they were closing Catholic schools, they were jailing Catholic priests and nuns, and they were basically saying, you need to come to some kind of agreement with us so that otherwise this is how things are going to go from now on. So the church was kind of backed into a bit of a corner. Do we have no constraints on the Nazis at all, or do we at least have some basis for objections? And they kind of thought that having a concordat would give them that sort of basis. What they didn't know was that Hitler was very good at breaking agreements that he made. Joseph Stalin made the same mistake. So did Chamberlain. These guys all made agreements with the Nazis, and then Hitler rode roughshod over all of them. So a lot of people underestimated Hitler and the Nazis in the early 1930s. But if we look at statements by Eugenio Pacelli, the guy who became Pius XII, he recognized the Nazis as being uniquely evil very early on, because he was papal nuncio, sort of like papal diplomat, to the government of Bavaria when the Nazi party was this tiny little pack of nobodies. And he was writing letters back to Rome as early as 1921 saying, these guys are dangerous, like they're small, but this is the kind of radical party that could cause real problems. So he was actually highly perceptive. Most people were dismissing Hitler and these guys at that stage. And he was saying, no, there's real potential danger here. And he never changed his tune. He hated Hitler and he despised the Nazis. Where things get complicated, though, is the Allies, once the war broke out, the Allies really wanted the Pope to be very much openly on their side. The Pope Pius XII was a strange man. He was a natural diplomat, and he maintained a very, very strong policy of outward neutrality, political neutrality. But it was a fine line because he also maintained a policy of moral condemnation. So he did make statements, and he got his bishops to make statements condemning Nazi policies, particularly regarding euthanasia, and then once, the deportation of Jews, and then once it was starting to become clear that Jews were being killed, he did make statements about, how terrible it was that people, for no crime other than their race, that they were being massacred and exterminated. Where the problem lies is that some people say, and I'd say with some justification, that he could have come out and been much more explicit in those outward expressions of condemnation. He at the time agonized over it, and we know this from memoirs written by his personal secretary and people very, very close to him. But he thought he was doing the right thing by keeping it politically neutral as much as he could, because he didn't want Catholics, of whom there were millions in the occupied territories in the Third Reich, to have to choose between their religion and persecution by the Nazis. He also had a problem that as he said to the Allies many times, if I condemn Hitler's atrocities, I have to condemn the Soviet Union's atrocities as well. Do you want that? And of course, the Soviet Union were allied with Britain and the United States. So on that front, he could probably be criticised. But was he pro-Nazi? Hell no. And in fact, there's an excellent book by a guy called, I'm trying to recall his name, Riebling, called Church of Spies, the Vatican's secret war against the Nazis, where he makes it absolutely clear that the Vatican actually worked with both allies, the espionage arms or the intelligence arms of the Allies, and resistance groups within Germany to overthrow the Nazi regime and to kill Hitler. And he was actually instrumental in the July 1944 plot, the von Stauffenberg plot, to blow Hitler up. So to say that he was pro-Nazi when he was working behind the scenes, he wasn't openly doing this. He was working behind the scenes to try to not only see Hitler overthrown, but to kill him, and was actually saying in theologically, he's a tyrant. He fits all the criteria of a tyrant, and so it is lawful theologically to kill the guy. He's definitely not pro-Nazi. So where it gets complicated is, could he have been more open outwardly in his opposition? The answer is probably yeah.
He could have, at the very least, excommunicated, some of the leadership within the Nazi Party or of the SS.
And that was certainly considered. The problem there is people, particularly people who don't really understand the arcane theological and canon law tangles of the Catholic Church, they think that excommunication is this punishment for being naughty. So you get kicked out of the church because you're naughty. That's not how it works. Excommunication is where someone who thinks that they are a Catholic and thinks that they're presenting Catholic ideas and embodying Catholic ideas through their actions, but are in theological error, gets told, you aren't right. We're not right with you. And until you change your ways, you are not going to receive the sacrament. So you can't go to Mass, you can't go to confession. And until you change your ways, you are excommunicado, you are excommunicated. Hitler wasn't in communication with the Catholic Church. He'd stopped going to church at the age of 17. So would it have had any kind of effect? The answer is probably not. But certainly what we do know is that Pacelli and his cardinals discussed it, and in the end decided that it probably wasn't worth the backlash that it would have gained by the Nazis. So were they right, were they wrong? We don't know. But what we do know is that the Nazis did, every time the say Vatican Radio got a bit strident in its anti-Nazi condemnation, it would start rounding people up and shooting some of them. So it's probably a little easy for us, with the benefit of hindsight, to say he should have done X or Y. But when you look at the to and fro of discussion it actually becomes a lot less clear.
Mm.
So, look, that's debatable. What isn't debatable is, was he pro-Nazi? He wasn't. He was vehemently anti-Nazi. He hated Hitler, and he worked to overthrow him and actually try to kill him. So Hitchens couldn't be more wrong.
Wait, Tim, are you saying that history is complicated and it's a nuanced?
Kind of is, yes. And this is one of the funny things. Like, people like to latch on to stories like that. And because they confirm, it's confirmation bias, because they confirm certain ideas. Catholic Church, we all hate the Catholic Church, pack of pricks. So if you come across a story, an idea that the Pope was pro-Nazi, then it's easy to simply accept that without question. And the problem is, we're not meant to do that as rationalists. We're meant to question everything. So if you actually go and have a look at the evidence, you find it's not true, or you find it's misrepresented. You mentioned, for example, that I often hear the Nazis had Gott mit uns, God with us, on their belt buckles. Well, actually, that's not true. The Wehrmacht did. That was the German army. But the Nazis had slogans on their belt buckles that didn't make any reference to Christianity at all. Their slogans were things like, my honor is truth, and all that stuff. So why did the German army have Gott mit uns on their belt buckles? Well, it wasn't because the Nazis were pro-Christian. It was because that was a traditional motto, a slogan of the German army, and had been since about the 18th century. It was originally a Prussian heraldic motto. So does that mean anything about Hitler and Catholicism? No. It's got no connection. But I often hear that being cited because it's an idea that people have latched onto, and what they haven't bothered to do is actually check context, check background, check origin, and this is what historians do.
Yeah. And, like you were saying, there's plenty of other things that are wrong with the Catholic Church that we can easily latch onto that are valid. We don't even have to go back a decade to see, dozens of massive scandals of priests diddling kids in the church, covering it up.
And the church covering it up. So you don't have to make stuff up, and you don't have to latch onto myths. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. No, that said, I think most people who will share this stuff, it's not coming from a malicious place of willful ignorance and lying. It's coming from a place of they've heard a story, they figure it's true, and they pass it along.
Yeah.
But for the sake of time, we got to push through a few more of these. See if we can get through 6, and then I do want to open it up for questions. So actually, right now, for anyone who's interested in having their questions answered in this conversation, if you make a super chat in if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see the little $sign. If you click on that, you can type in a question, pledge however much you want. It both supports the show, and also Eric is going to be collecting the super chats, and we'll throw them up on screen, and you can ask Tim or myself a question towards the end of the show. So if you want to get those in now, we'll answer a few more of these, and then we'll jump to questions. The next one that I want to ask you is about the Council of Nicea. Did the Council of Nicea establish biblical canon? And I think some of the confusion here comes from the idea that within the early church, we know that there wasn't initially just one Bible canon, and it wasn't just like the Bible as we see it today. There were a lot of different books. Some people saw some as canonical, some people didn't. And over time, there formed this consensus. And that process, I think there's a lot of confusion surrounding. But where does this idea that it was just voted into action at the Council of Nicea, where does that come from, and what historical evidence is there that that's not true?
Okay. Well, the short answer to your first question, did it happen at the Council of Nicea, is no. And just getting back to your point about people repeating this stuff without checking their facts, all you have to do is type Council of Nicea into Google and click on the Wikipedia page, and you'll see there's a whole section there on myths about the Council of Nicea. And it will say, no, was not discussed. It wasn't even discussed. It wasn't that they didn't vote on it. So where did it come from? It actually came from a throwaway line by Voltaire. So Voltaire was a French philosopher, satirical writer in 18th century France. He wasn't an atheist, but he wasn't Christian. He certainly wasn't a fan of Christianity. And he was a very funny guy. His books are hilarious and highly influential on non-believers from the 18th century onwards. He made a kind of a throwaway line. He found a bit of an anecdote that was clearly nonsense, about how the Bible had been put together. He made a bit of a joke about it. It then just got repeated, and it's now become like this one of these things that everyone knows. It's complete crap. The Council of Nicea didn't vote on the canon of the Bible, didn't even discuss it. So,
well, it got picked up by the Da Vinci Code, I believe.
Yeah, the Da Vinci Code didn't help because that was one of about 1,000 things that the Da Vinci Code gets wrong. It's the stupidest book ever written. So if you're getting a history from the Da Vinci Code, you probably need to throw that away and actually buy a book by a proper historian. So where did the canon of the Bible came from? Well, it kind of evolved. The four Gospels, for example, seem to have been the ones that everyone kind of went with from about the 2nd century onwards, mid-2nd century. It's quite early on. Most of the discussion, most of the debate about what books were scriptural and what weren't, were largely about the minor works. So some of the epistles, whether or not Revelation only just managed to squeak into the canon. Most people were kind of against it. They thought it was a bit wacky. So it's interesting when you talk to all these fundamentalist Christians who take it very, very literally, that it almost wasn't in the New Testament at all. And there are other books that most people have never heard of, such as The Shepherd of Hermas, that almost made it in, but didn't. When I say almost made it in, lots of people considered it scriptural, and other people didn't. And eventually the consensus came down against it being scriptural. It was still used, but it wasn't regarded as the word of God. So the canon evolved organically. And so the idea that there was a bad guy, because the Emperor Constantine is often the bad guy in a lot of these historical stories. So the idea that there was a bad guy who kind of hijacked Christianity and did so for political power, that's another myth. That one's pretty common because it's a pretty strong Protestant idea, because the Protestant church has always sort of seen itself as an extension of the early church. So there had to have been a point where things went off the rails and the Catholic Church kind of got control, and then Protestantism came along and put things right. And so the Catholic, the Protestant myth is that Constantine was really the problem here.
Have is the idea that Christmas comes from paganism.
Right.
Where does this originate? And I know there's this idea that Christmas was actually derived from celebrations of Mithras. There's ideas of Odin being sort of the early embodiment of Santa Claus. That the Yule log is a pagan tradition. The Christmas tree was initially a pagan tradition. Are you saying that like none of that is true, or there's a part of it?
Almost none of it. The date of Christmas was something that was the date on which early Christians commemorated Jesus' birth. There were various dates, and December 25th was just one. The fact that December 25th was chosen probably has something to do with the fact that was traditionally the winter solstice, but it wasn't the main reason why they were celebrating Jesus' birth on that date, because they were trying to map Jesus' life onto a cosmic scale. And so what we know they were doing was they were saying, well, if he died on, as was traditionally thought, if he died on March 25th, then he must have been conceived on March 25th, because there was a tradition that prophets died on the same day that they were conceived. Sorry, they were born. They thought that Jesus had been conceived on the same day that he had died. So that's March 25th. 9 months after March 25th is December 25th. Now, the fact that December 25th was also the solstice and March 25th is an equinox actually meant that the whole thing seemed to work on a cosmic scale. So did it have anything to do with sort of non-Christian ideas? Yeah, kind of. But the thing is, we don't have any evidence that December 25th was some kind of great big pagan festival. In fact, we have none. Right. So this is the problem. And Mithras, the idea that Mithras had some kind of celebration on December 25th, there's no evidence for that, none. And the idea that Odin had something to do with it, people sort of say things like, well, Odin had a long white beard. Odin flew through the sky on an 8-legged horse. Santa Claus has 8 reindeer and has a white beard, therefore Odin. The problem with all that is the reindeer is a 19th century development. It comes from an American poem. The idea that Odin flew through the sky, well, actually, that evidence is pretty sketchy. He may not have. He did ride an 8-legged horse, but 8 reindeer were a late development anyway. A white beard, well, actually, Santa Claus is quite often depicted with not a white beard, and Odin was usually referred to as having a grey beard, not a white one. There's absolutely no connection. But people just sort of go, well, here's an element that looks a bit the same, let's put it together. The problem is most of the stuff that they're taking about Santa Claus are very late developments. They're not traditional developments. And we also get, the stuff about the Yule log and the Christmas tree, those were pagan things. The Yule log, no, there doesn't seem to be any actual evidence for that. It may have been. Christmas trees, though, definitely not. They seem to have come from a Christian tradition about the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, which has its origins in Germany, where they used to do a kind of a religious play on Christmas Eve about Adam and Eve. And so they'd have a tree which was decorated with red baubles to represent apples. And people started to put those sorts of trees up at Christmas time in about the 16th century. And the Christmas trees then spread from Germany to the rest of the world in the 19th century. So it wasn't like there was some kind of widespread pagan tradition of decorating trees. This thing actually began in the late Middle Ages and developed in Germany in the early modern period. Not pagan.
Well, I want to make a distinction too, because when trying to tie two things together historically, when trying to show that one influenced the other, you don't just have to show that they are similar enough. You don't have to just show that, oh, this looks like this, or that one predated the other. There has to be some sort of causal connection. So I don't think you would deny that there are pagan traditions that would have a tree as, some sort of, symbol of either fertility or life. You look at Asherah and the ancient Canaanite cults and stuff, and there was often a tree that would represent this female deity figure. But in order to say that that was the inspiration for the Christmas tree, you have to somehow find a link to show that there was a strong influence, that there's someone, attributing it to it at the time that it's coming up, that there's more than just this looks kind of vaguely visually similar.
And that's what these arguments often boil down to, Thomas, which is, well, here's a thing and here's another thing. They look similar and therefore they must be connected. And that's a non sequitur. People had traditions about trees. People had traditions about mistletoe. That doesn't mean that therefore one tradition automatically has to be derived from another. And it's this very strange, there's this very strange idea, which comes from the 19th century again. 19th century folklorists were really keen on saying anything that's traditional is ancient and anything that's ancient is pagan. And so this idea has really permeated popular culture and people just accept it. But the problem is a lot of these traditions aren't ancient. And a lot of the traditions that actually are quite old aren't old enough to be pagan. And then there's the problem of, even when there are genuine parallels, such as mistletoe, there doesn't actually seem to be any kind of causal connection or connecting derivation. So it's not good enough, as you say, to simply say, well, here's the thing and here's another thing. They look a bit the same, therefore connected. Yeah. That's a weak argument, and no historian would accept that argument.
Well, people do that in the realm of like pseudo-archaeology, where they'll look at pyramids and they'll say, oh, here's a pyramid in South America, and here's one over on the other side of the world in Egypt, and so therefore they had to have both been made by aliens.
Yeah.
And it's a similar architectural structure that anyone could have thought up, that's just wide base, narrow top.
Yeah, and also I often ask people, well, why do you think that for the 1,500 years of European Christianity, could Christians have not come up with new traditions? People come up with new traditions all the time. They want to come up with traditions that are still about things like ivy, mistletoe, and trees, but that doesn't mean that those are connected to any kind of older traditions. I once asked someone about this and said, well, how old do you think the elf on the shelf tradition is? And she said, oh, I think it goes back to the 19th century, and was a bit shocked to understand that it goes back to 2005.
Oh, wow.
Right?
I didn't know it was that young.
It was a marketing campaign for a children's book. But people now do it all over the world at Christmas time. Now, anyone in the future sort of says, well, it's to do with elves, and it's this tradition that's been going on for a long time, therefore it must be some ancient pagan tradition, would be making a similar sort of argument to people make about the Christmas tree, and would be completely wrong.
Interesting.
We're being given a hurry up by your producer, so we should
probably.
probably.
Don't worry about him. We're having fun.
All right, cool.
The next one that I have, the next great myth of history, is the idea that Giordano Bruno was a martyr for proposing heliocentrism.
Yeah.
Is this based, in fact, he was a martyr, I believe, but maybe you can elaborate on where this. Because I think real quick, the idea for those who aren't familiar is that basically the church persecuted a scientist for proposing a scientific idea, and he was ultimately burned at the stake for being a heretic because he followed science rather than the church.
Yeah, so the martyr for science, and people often talk about, you know, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages suppressed science because they burnt scientists at the stake and so on. And whenever I ask people to give me an example, the one example I always get, because it's the only one that they can come up with, is Giordano Bruno. Now, this is despite the fact that 1, he wasn't a scientist, 2, his ideas were not scientific at all, 3, he wasn't in the Middle Ages, and 4, he wasn't burnt for believing in heliocentrism. So that pretty much means every element of the claim is completely wrong. So who was Giordano Bruno? He was a very strange dude, and he was one of a number of eccentric, brilliant but eccentric scholars who were kind of wandering around in the early modern period, so just after the Middle Ages. He was a former Dominican friar who had run away from his monastic house. He was an expert in mnemonics more than anything else. So the art of memory and how to remember large amounts of information. He was definitely a brilliant guy, but he was a bit of a nut. So he believed that he believed lots of kooky mystical stuff. He believed that the planets and stars were inhabited were souls. He believed in magic. He believed that he had uncovered the original true religion of Egypt, which was this garbled sort of esoteric nonsense that he'd largely made up. He believed that he could apprehend all this truth through intuition rather than through reason. He did latch on to some of the early scientific ideas that were floating around at the time, even though he didn't really understand them. So yes, he was one of the early champions of heliocentrism. So this is in the late 16th century, and he championed Copernicus and his heliocentric model, which was still very much under discussion, was not generally accepted by scientists at the time because they had some problems, but it fitted with Bruno's mystical conception. He had this sort of mystical cosmology, and the idea of the Earth not being at the centre fitted his mystical ideas. The one work of Bruno's where he actually discusses the Copernican model, he shows that he didn't understand it at all. He gets stuff, fundamental stuff wrong. This guy not only wasn't a scientist by our standards, he wasn't a scientist by the standards of the late 16th, early 17th century. So none of the guys at the time who were working in these areas, Galileo, Kepler, and so on, regarded him as being part of their club. Galileo once criticised Kepler for an idea, saying that's the kind of thing Bruno would say. That was not a compliment. And Kepler referred to Bruno as a monster and wrote a letter saying how happy he was once he was burnt at the stake. Bruno was the guy who was burnt at the stake in 1599. So where did the idea that he was burnt at the stake because he was a scientist come from? It's sort of a conflation of the fact that he did accept heliocentrism and he got burnt at the stake by the Roman Inquisition. So people have, particularly a couple of 19th century writers, John William Draper in particular, have put those two things together and held him up as a martyr for science. And he's the epitome of this anti-science attitude of the Catholic Church. well, actually, he wasn't a scientist. He didn't arrive at any of those ideas through any kind of scientific reasoning. He actually poured scorn on the idea of using mathematics to measure the universe. He said it was limiting, and he called scientists like Kepler and Galileo, he called them mere geometers. So he was not in any way a scientist. But more importantly, he was not burned at the stake for anything to do with heliocentrism. And we know that because heliocentrism was never, and I need to emphasize this, never declared heretical. But after Bruno's time, during the early 17th century, as part of the Galileo affair, it was declared vehemently suspect of heresy, which is not the same thing. You can't be burned at the stake for being merely vehemently suspect of heresy. But that was after Bruno's death anyway. So if Bruno had been burned at the stake for anything to do with heliocentrism, the Inquisition would not have needed to sit down in 1616, that's 17 years after Bruno's execution, and work out if there was anything at all heretical about heliocentrism. They would have already have done that. And the Inquisition worked by case law and precedent. So if the ruling against Bruno had been about heliocentrism, they would simply have referred to that. The reason we have to kind of guess, though, about what he was burnt for was the documents regarding his execution have been lost. So we're trying to kind of piece together from various bits of evidence. So why was he burnt at the stake? Well, he denied that Jesus was God. He denied that the Virgin Mary was a virgin. He denied that the resurrection happened, and he believed a whole lot of kooky stuff about divine stars and magic. That's why. He also did believe that there were other worlds with aliens on them and so on, but that wasn't, and that seems to have been one of the reasons why he was burnt at the stake. But that wasn't unique to him. In fact, he got that idea from a guy called Nicholas Acusa, who was a Catholic cardinal. So that wasn't an idea that would get you killed automatically. Though if you also denied Jesus was God, denied the virgin birth, denied transubstantiation, and believed a whole lot of other kooky stuff, and believe that, then yeah, you could find yourself in 1599, getting burned at the stake. Now, I need to emphasise, I'm not saying it was good that he was burned at the stake. Some people, when I point out that he wasn't burned at the stake for heliocentrism, they're saying, well, you're defending the Catholic Church for burning him at the stake. I think burning people alive for their ideas is bad. Let me state that clearly.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yes, I'm going to put that on the record. But the point is, if you're going to make an argument, a historical argument about what the significance of his horrible execution was, you need to get it right. So to claim that he was burnt because he was a scientist is wrong. He wasn't. To claim that he was burnt because he believed in heliocentrism is wrong. He wasn't. It wasn't regarded heresy in 1599. So that one's a myth too.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why it's so easy to accept this one in particular is because most of us can pull just from recent memory times when the church has tried to suppress some kind of information, whether it's Protestant evangelical groups that will teach young earth creationism and will say that the earth is 6,000 years old and evolution didn't happen. Or when I was younger, I remember various homeschool groups and Christian communities that would ban Harry Potter, or they would have, they'd be super adamantly opposed to Pokemon because they thought it was demonic, or in the Satanic Panic, you'd break heavy metal CDs and stuff.
This was another one in the
Dungeons and Dragons, yeah. And this history of suppressing things that are deemed heretical or deemed to be dangerous ideas, it's not a new idea. That the Catholic Church is famous for its Index Librorum Prohibitorum, which is like this library of banned books that are seen as heretical by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, so it kind of it reinforces that idea. But I mentioned Andrew Dixon White before, and there's another 19th century American writer called Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper. They both wrote books that established this idea that's known as the Conflict Thesis. And the Conflict Thesis was that religion and science have been at war down through the centuries. and the church and religion generally have been trying to suppress science, and science has been trying to advance humanity. And this idea of the conflict thesis was caught on in the late 19th century, and again, it's permeated popular culture so that people just accept it. So when someone says, Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake because he believed in heliocentrism, or when they look at the Galileo affair and they see that as see presented as a straight science versus religion conflict, which it wasn't. It was much more complicated politically than that. They accept that because this idea of the conflict thesis is well grounded in popular culture. Actual historians of science have rejected the conflict thesis for about a century now. And what they now say is, I suppose you could sum it up by saying it's complicated. So yeah, there are examples of conflict between science and religion, and creationism is probably the obvious one. But to say that that is the norm is actually wrong. And there are actually quite a few examples of where religious belief has driven scientific discoveries. And if we look at Newton, he comes out and says, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to illuminate the mind of God through my scientific, I mean, he didn't use that word, but I'm summarizing what he was expressing through my scientific examination. Same with Kepler. Kepler said the same thing. So it isn't right to pick on a couple of examples of conflict and say that's the norm. And because White and Draper were trying to do that, what they had to do was they had to make up some examples because there weren't actually a whole lot of evidence to support their thesis. So this is why they were the ones who created the Bruno myth. And there's several other myths that they are responsible for as well. Historians of science, however, reject that simplistic idea of religion and science being always in conflict.
Yeah. I mean, for me, personally, having been raised so deeply in the church and having been taught not only that it was all literal, but that all of these miracles happened, and that was the explanation for so many things around me that now I'm starting to find are naturally explainable. I think it's difficult to not see the church in that light because of how many examples I have just from personally witnessing them as well as hearing them from others, that when you take it further back in time and history, obviously it does become more nuanced, and you have various people who are wanting to pursue how the world works, and some of them are motivated by their faith and their beliefs. But the thing is that with all religions, they're so complicated and there's so many ways of interpreting them that I spoke with my parents a while back about climate change, and they saw the Bible as telling us that we should be good stewards of our environment and take care of the earth, whereas others will read it as Jesus is coming back soon and this world is temporary. So it's so easy to interpret it and use it to motivate all kinds of actions. And mm,
Biblical literalism. Biblical literalism is actually, in its modern sort of fundamentalist Protestant form, is actually a very modern thing. It's largely something that developed substantially in the early 19th century. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, for example, did not teach that the Bible should always be interpreted literally. They had 4 levels of interpretation, of which the literal was only one. So therefore, for example, in the 12th century, and right smack bang in the middle of the Middle Ages, you had a guy called William of Conches writing about the Book of Genesis and looking at the bit where it says that God created Adam out of the dust of the earth, and saying, well, what does that mean? Maybe it means that heat from the sun acted on mud in such a way that life spontaneously arose from it, and then smaller and simpler forms of life developed into more complex ones, and eventually they became people. This is in the 12th century. This is a medieval monk reading his Bible and coming up with an idea that sounds remarkably like evolution. And no, he wasn't burnt at the stake.
but then you have others like Usher that added up all of the genealogies going back to Adam and gave a date for the Earth as being, you know.
Yeah, but at the same time, you had other people who were saying that the days of Genesis were symbolic, not literal.
Literal days.
And
Yeah.
we could be talking about vast stretches of time. This is why it's really important to actually go back and have a look at what various people thought, rather than latching on to. I mean, you get Usher raised all the time, but who was disagreeing with Usher, and what were the alternatives? So this is why it's important when you're studying history to not simply cherry pick the bits that seem to fit what you want, but to look more broadly. And what I find, unfortunately, is that a lot of our fellow atheists are too keen to cherry pick and not keen enough to actually do the hard work of understanding context. Once you do that, most of these ideas collapse.
But at the same time, if you go back to particular instances, we talked about the Council of Nicea earlier. And, one of these early notions was the doctrine of the Trinity. Was Jesus literally a man? Was he fully human? Did he, die on the cross for our sins? Did this literally happen? Did this take place? Like, was he also fully God, literally divine? Is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are they one entity? And these were things that it wasn't so much, oh, you have your belief, I have mine. There came a point where it became church doctrine, and to oppose and push back against that church doctrine wasn't just, well, you read it metaphorically, you do your thing, I do mine, live and let live. It became the basis of heresy.
On certain points, absolutely. There was a bit more leeway on others, though. So, for example, lots of people sort of say, well, religion couldn't have been compatible with science because the church had ultimate authority. Well, actually, the church did believe in what was called the two books doctrine, and that was that there was the book of God, which was the Bible and the writings of the church fathers, the theological basis of Christianity, and then there was the book of nature, which was our understanding of the physical world and our understanding of the cosmos. And the doctrine of the Catholic Church to this day is that those two books are both compatible because they both ultimately come from God. And that meant there was a lot of leeway through reading the book of nature to sort of say, well, this doesn't quite fit with what the Bible says. That doesn't mean we therefore throw it away. We look at how we interpret the Bible. So best example, and I think this was one of the ones you wanted me to touch on, the earth being round versus flat. Maybe we should flick to that one and
yeah, we'll flip to that one, but can we cover that one in 3 minutes or 2 minutes or less, because we got to jump to the super chats.
All right, I'll try to be real fast.
All right, bullet points.
Did people in the Middle Ages believe the earth was flat? Well, the church certainly didn't teach that the earth was flat. And that's because before the Middle Ages, back in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, they had looked at the bits in the Bible that seemed to indicate that the earth was flat. And they'd looked at the scientific knowledge of the Greeks that they inherited that made it pretty clear that the earth was round. And they said, well, these both can't be true. So what do we do? Now, you would think what they would do is reject the science and simply go with the Bible says this, therefore that's the case. They didn't. What they did was they said, well, the book of nature is saying one thing, the book of God seems to be saying something else. So we're misreading the book of God. These passages that seem to talk about the earth being flat are not to be read literally. And so that literal interpretation of the Bible was abandoned, was rejected in favor of the science of the day. So this goes completely against the claim that the church always upholds the Bible. Historically, it actually has sometimes reconciled the two by saying, okay, then we interpreted that symbolically, allegorically, we interpreted that in a non-literal way. So the Catholic Church never taught that the earth was flat. This is another 19th century myth. This one stems from a novel by Washington Irving, where he wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus. He was asked by his publishers to write this biography. He then sat down, did the research, and realized that the story was really boring. So what he had to do is he had to come up with a bit of conflict to spice the story up. So he made up the whole idea that the Catholic Church taught that the earth was flat until Columbus sailed to America. And it went in the book. The book became a bestseller. It's now become part of popular culture, and it's simply wrong. We know it's wrong because basic textbooks on astronomy from the Middle Ages talk about the Earth being round, give the standard proofs of the Earth being round, refer to Aristotle's proofs of the Earth being round, and we also know that this was common knowledge, not just known to scholars, because we have popular stories that talk about a man who walked so far into the east that he eventually came back to his home from the west. In other words, he circumnavigated the globe. That story doesn't make sense unless the audience understood the Earth to be round. We also
I would have
the Earth being round like a ball or round like an apple.
I would have to push back on you a little bit here before we go to super chats. And by the way, if anyone wants their questions answered, we're going to try to hit as many of the super chats as we can. I think we should be able to get to all of them, but if you make them now, then Eric should have time to get them in. But where I would push back on that idea that, oh, you know, the church never claimed that the Earth was flat. Maybe the Catholic Church might not have. I don't know the entire history there. And obviously, you know, some people might have one belief and others might hold another, then some are recorded and some aren't. But I would say if you go a little bit further back before the Greeks to the Old Testament and the biblical descriptions of the Earth, I don't think it was meant to be taken figuratively because it stems from the Mesopotamian origins of a flat Earth, and there's influence from Sumerians and Akkadians and Canaanites who all held to this view of a flat Earth with, you know, the waters in the heavens separate from the water on the land, and that there's a thin firmament that's keeping the water at bay, and it's all on a flat plane.
So the Bible is clearly, I think you're absolutely right, the Bible is clearly presenting a ancient Near East cosmology, which is a flat Earth cosmology. Keep in mind that almost all cosmologies prior to the Greeks were flat Earth cosmologies. And the Chinese maintained a flat Earth cosmology right into the modern period until eventually Westerners managed to convince them that the Earth was round. And that was in the 17th and 18th centuries. And those guys weren't stupid. So the idea that you know, it's obvious that the Earth is round, actually it isn't. It does take a bit of work to arrive at that conclusion. But once the Greeks had arrived at that conclusion, the early church inherited that intellectual legacy, and so then had to try and reconcile it with the Bible, which, as you say, definitely was saying that the Earth was flat. And as I said, what they did was they said, all right, well, we're going to reinterpret the Bible and make it non-literal.
I think we are ready for some super chats. Eric, do you have those to throw up on screen for us to hammer off? The first one from Hazev the Wolf. Thank you so much for the $20 super chat. Says fascinating stuff. Thank you, Thomas. Drakenminch Silverflare, hopefully I pronounced that right, says, if Christians believed in pray away the gay, doesn't that open up the possibility that we pray the gay into them in return? I've never thought about that, but I suppose it does, unless God only answers homophobic prayers.
I'm going to take that as a comment. I can't. That's not really a historical question.
Do we have any questions that are for Tim? We have, which books would Tim recommend on reading about the resurrection?
Okay.
We didn't have time to touch on Jesus mythicism.
Well, that would take several hours. I think maybe we could do a follow-up, mate. But the book that I would definitely recommend is one that came out just last year. And it's a book by Dale C. Allison Jr. called The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, and History. And I happen to have it right here. It's a brilliant book. Allison is a Christian, but you kind of wouldn't know it. He's very much a liberal Christian.
Yeah, he's extremely progressive.
He is.
I think he's gay too.
There's very little that Allison says about Jesus that I actually disagree with. Allison is one of the best proponents of the idea of Jesus as an apocalyptic preacher, as a guy who believed that the end of the world was coming in his lifetime, and who died in that belief and was wrong, which is a pretty remarkable set of ideas for a Christian to hold. It makes sense for someone like me or Bart Ehrman or Paula Fredrickson or any of the non-Christian scholars who hold that view. But Allison, I have a great deal of time for because he, unlike many Christian scholars, people like N.T. Wright and Lecona and these more conservative scholars, he goes where the evidence leads. And this book is probably one of the most comprehensive. I mean, it is densely argued, but one of the most comprehensive analyses of what could have happened and how the resurrection beliefs could have arisen. And he's exhaustive in his analysis of the scholarship and absolutely forensic. It's not a light read, but everyone I know who's read it agrees that this is now the standard when it comes to books on the resurrection. And I know Christians who have read it and come away with their faith still pretty much intact. I know others who are quite vehement that this is a book of horrible heresy. I think it's a great book to get your head around the way in which this stuff can be analysed from a historical perspective.
Yeah.
I should state pretty clearly, I don't think Jesus rose from the fucking dead. Right?
Can you speak to the Book of Thomas?
Yeah.
I'm assuming that that's about the Gospel of Thomas and not about a book that I write or may write in the future.
No, well, I look forward to your book, Thomas. But the Gospel of Thomas is one of a number of what we call non-canonical Gospels. So we've got the 4 Gospels that are found in the Bible and have been regarded as canonical, as I mentioned earlier, since about the 2nd century. So that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John. But then we have quite a few other texts which are Gospels, which are written in the Gospel form and which were regarded as also as being equivalent to those canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas is interesting, though, because it's one of the earliest. A lot of those other Gospels are actually quite late. So you've got works like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Judas, which are kind of late 2nd century, even 3rd or even 4th century. So it's kind of it's interesting because this one might be as early as around about the same time as the Gospel of John or the Gospel or even of Luke. The interesting thing about the Gospel of Thomas is that it's largely a sayings gospel. So there's not a lot in there about Jesus going to some place or doing stuff. There's no account of the crucifixion or the resurrection in it. It's largely Jesus said or Jesus taught. Some of the sayings in it actually parallel the sayings that we have in the canonical Gospels, but with slight variants. And some of them are very interesting in their own right, in that they show the way in which Christianity was diversifying in that early period, particularly in the 2nd century, where it broke up into all kinds of weird and wacky and wonderful versions. I would recommend Bart Ehrman's book Lost Christianities, which is on this period and on the fracturing of Christian belief and the vast variety of ideas. One thing I would say, though, is I came across this yesterday, someone saying that the 4 Gospels were chosen from 40 potential Gospels. That's bullshit. We've got possibly evidence of maybe 16, including the 4 that we have. So 16, when I say some evidence, we've either got copies of them, like with the Gospel of Thomas, or we've got fragments of them, or we've got references to them. But the 40 Gospels is another idea that seems to have popped up thanks to our friend Voltaire, and then got spread around by Thomas Jefferson, the American president. And it's nonsense. We don't have evidence of 40 Gospels. That's not true.
Although there probably were more than 16.
Probably were.
That some weren't lost.
Yeah. And that's because the gospel became a kind of a genre, and all kinds of people were writing them and then attributing them to people like Thomas, Judas, as a way of giving them authority. So the Gospel of Thomas almost certainly wasn't written by Thomas any more than the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of John were written by those guys.
The funny and ironic thing too is that most of our non-canonical Gospels were discovered after Voltaire's time, anyways, like the Nag Hammadi library and stuff.
Copies of. We kind of knew about most of those books before the Nag Hammadi,
because they were mentioned by church scholars.
Yeah. So we have fragments of them, but now we've got whole copies of them, which is what made the Nag Hammadi find so significant.
Micah Herrera says, what, if any, are reliable methods to learning the truth of history correctly? You mentioned Hitchens' misconceptions, and he was a prolific reader. So how do we safeguard ourselves against, getting that stuff wrong? How do we find good sources when it comes to history?
Okay, look, yes, Hitchens was a prolific reader. Unfortunately, Hitchens was more of a journalist and a polemicist than he was a scholar. He wasn't a scholar. So he was a guy who was very, very good at presenting eloquent and convincing arguments, and was happy to do that. Once he fixed on a particular idea, he was really good at presenting in a way that was highly convincing. So during the lead up to the Iraq War, for example, he was one of the leading proponents of the idea that the Iraq War was a very good idea, and he was wrong. Hitchens was often wrong about a lot of stuff, and I gave some examples before in his statements about Hitler, all of which were fundamentally wrong. So how did a smart guy like Hitchens get so much wrong about, for example, about Hitler? Well, it's because he started with his conclusion. The Catholic Church is bad, Hitler was bad, the Catholic Church must have been friends with Hitler. Here's a book by John Cornwell, Hitler's Pope, that I kind of like the sound of, and so I'm just going to present what he says without critically examining whether it's true. And so the problem lies in starting with your conclusion, which is what Hitchens did. So this is what I was talking about when I was talking about cherry picking. It's very easy to start with your conclusion and then go and find bits of evidence that seem to support it. And a lot of people think that that's how you study history. It isn't. What you do is you examine all of the relevant evidence, and this is why history is a very difficult and painstaking and time-consuming thing to study. Then you develop your conclusions from that study, and then you go back and hone that and test it and look at alternatives until you can present a thesis that seems to be the best representation of what is most likely to have happened and why it's most likely that that happened. And that's really difficult to do. So this is why I often caution people not to get their history from popular culture, from movies, from novels. We mentioned the Da Vinci Code before, which is a particularly notoriously bad example, or from, or even just from popular books. So a lot of people get their history of science, for example, from scientists. Neil deGrasse Tyson quite often talks about the history of science. Carl Sagan quite often wrote about the history of science. Scientists are terrible at history. Neil deGrasse Tyson is absolutely appalling on the history of science. Historians of science tear their hair out every time he tweets some crap about science history because he's got like 4 billion followers and everyone accepts what he says. After all, he's a scientist. He must be right about the history of science. Well, he didn't study history past high school level. So no. And the same with Sagan. Sagan perpetuated some absolute nonsense. The burning of the Great Library of Alexandria, which we didn't get to. Most of that crap, it's all wrong, didn't happen. Christians didn't burn down the Great Library of Alexandria, but lots of people share parts of Sagan's documentary Cosmos where he says that they did, and they just accept it. So don't
the science is
good. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, the science is good because that's what their expertise is in physics, cosmology, astronomy. But when it comes to, I think just to hone that last question a little bit, obviously going through and doing the due diligence, taking the time to explore all of the different evidence can be really, really hard, especially if you're looking at, you're trying to read Old Testament texts and all you have are a few fragments and they're hard to read and they're in a language you don't understand and you're trying to analyze it. And so how do you kind of weed out and find, who is a good expert to whose word should I take? Should I go to the History Channel? It sounds like history, but then they're promoting weird ancient aliens nonsense.
Yeah, don't go to the History Channel. Look, I mean, obviously most people don't have my passion for it and don't do what I do, which is like read dense works with lots of footnotes and then read works by other historians on the same topic and look at how they interact with each other. That takes literally years of study, and so I understand why people would find that potentially difficult. What I would say is that there are good historians and other critical scholars who write works for the general reader. So people like Bart Ehrman on the history of early Christianity is an excellent communicator and is good at synthesizing stuff in a highly accessible form. But I suppose another reason why I have my website is to kind of do the work for you. So, you know, these are topics that I've been studying for 35 years. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to curate and pull together what historians say so that you don't have to go and read the dozens of books that I've read. I'm happy to do the work. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I do.
One resource that I found really helpful in trying to determine scientific or historical consensus is I'll look at whenever there's conferences or seminars, lectures that are given in an academic setting at respectable universities, especially if it's a university that's known to be really good in a particular field. So like when it comes to the study of antiquity, the University of Chicago is excellent. It has a really good track record, hedging their statements and not just throwing out wild, speculation. And then if they disagree on some tiny minute thing, they'll rip each other apart on the details. And I think that gives you an idea of like, who are the people who in a particular field are well respected? What's the consensus on a particular idea? And then, what are they publishing on it? Where are they publishing? Is it peer reviewed? And when it comes to the academic publishing criteria, it's the same with, science, with history, with anything, where like, if it's not published work, if they're not doing their due diligence, if it's not, associated with a respectable academic journal and it's peer reviewed, then you want to take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you just said, but I'd really emphasize that point about consensus. Because the thing about history is that it's not a science. It's not like the sciences where you can actually measure stuff and come to definitive, potentially, many of the sciences anyway, the hard sciences, come to definitive answers on questions. In history, you can't. History is a process of structured and evidence-based process of subjectively analysing the past or evidence from the past and coming up with what is an assessment of what is likely to have happened. But the key word in there is subjective. So you never get a definitive answer. So, you mentioned Jesus mythicism before. People say to me, you can't prove Jesus existed. And I'll say, no, I can't. But then again, I can't prove that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon either. I think he most likely did, but that's how history works. You can't, until we invent a time machine, we can't go back and come up with a definitive answer. And this is why consensus is really important, because having worked in academia, I can tell you the one thing academics love to do is disagree with each other. It's kind of how the whole thing works. That's sort of how you drive your career, is by finding something you disagree with someone else on and presenting a new idea. So when historians or any scholars in the humanities subject come to an agreement on a point, that actually counts for something. That doesn't mean that that is therefore right, but it means it probably has a hell of a lot more weight than some lone maverick fringe scholar who's got a very different idea. Doesn't mean the maverick fringe scholar is therefore wrong, just means it probably is. And if the consensus is really important.
Yeah, and it's not just any consensus, it's expert consensus.
But I'm sorry, I should stress that. Yes, a consensus of expertise.
And the crazy thing is, if a maverick comes along and really, is absolutely brilliant, super, super smart, they're going to just change the world with this new idea about science or history, then they're probably smart enough to get a full ride scholarship to go to a university and engage their ideas with incredibly intelligent people in the field. They're probably going to blow right through college because they, it just comes naturally to them. Yeah. And what people don't understand is that in academia, there's a lot of those people, and most of them have PhDs now because they, were incredibly brilliant and talented in the field.
And they're unlikely to be someone who came up with this idea and then self-publishes it through a print-on-demand service and a website. That doesn't mean those people are always wrong, but they usually are.
Yeah. Have you heard the story of a lady who was killed in Venice for helping Leonardo with his math on his flying machine?
No.
No, you're not familiar.
That sounds like absolute crap. First of all, because Leonardo's
tell us how you really feel.
Yeah. Well, look, there's this. I mean, Leonardo is one of those subjects on which there's all sorts of nonsense flying around. First of all, there wasn't a whole lot of math involved in Leonardo's flying machine. Leonardo has this reputation as being this great scientist and great inventor. He was actually more of an artisan in the medieval tradition of the artisan artist. So he painted pictures, obviously, but he was also an engineer. He also put together party tricks for the Dukes of Milan. He was just this guy who kind of built and made stuff, and that was a very strong tradition in that part of Europe at that time. And so what we see when we look at things like his sketches of the flying machine is a brilliant guy who was a brilliant artist exploring an idea. But if you actually tried to build that flying machine, it wouldn't fly.
More of a futurist.
It's a pretty picture, but it wouldn't fly. And the idea there was some kind of mathematics involved. No, not really. It's a sketch. And so, yeah, I've never heard of that story, and that story reeks of absolute bullshit.
Because he didn't have any math in.
Well, he wasn't a bad mathematician, but I think he was just doodling. Nice doodle.
What happened to the original gospel drafts around 100 CE or so?
Not quite sure what that means. I mean, generally speaking, we have copies of any ancient book. So if there were original kind of manuscripts of any of those gospels, they're well and truly lost. The earliest fragments we have of the gospels, there's one that's claimed to be from 120. I actually disagree with that. That's the Rylands fragment. Most of the others are kind of dated to second, mainly third century. And then we don't get whole copies until about the 4th century. So that's about 400 years after they were written. So what happened to the original drafts? Well, the same thing that happened to all the original drafts of every ancient book ever written, and most books right up until fairly recently, they were lost. Someone made a copy, and other people, someone wrote it down, other people made copies were made of the copies. But most ancient books are lost. We have copies of maybe about 1% of what once existed, because there were very few copies of anything, and books were fragile, and it's a long fucking time ago. So,
stuff degrades over time.
That's it. Yeah.
Claudius, thank you so much for the 10 Canadian dollars, I'm assuming is CA. Thank you guys so much for streaming. Well, thank you for the donation. Eric, do we have any more questions to get to, or any other super chats, people to thank? Said that's it. Tim, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a lot of fun exploring these topics. I need to dive into your blog and explore all the posts I haven't read yet. I know there's a wealth of information there, and you cite a lot of good books too that are a great place to go to read more on these topics and to look into it more in depth. Is there anything that you would like to plug before you go?
No, look, I would encourage people to go and have a look at my site, obviously, because we've skimmed over some pretty big topics here, and there were several that we wanted to cover that we couldn't even touch. So, most of my articles, as I mentioned before, are pretty extensive. They average out at about 7,000 to 10,000 words. So, get a cup of coffee and a comfy chair if you're going to read them. I am trying to translate many of them into videos on my video channel. So I maybe if that's your preference, you could check those out. And then there's podcast audio versions of those as well. But what I would say is, I realize a lot of what I've said is kind of against the grain of what many atheists have believed and accepted. All I'd say to you is the way we're meant to work as rationalists is to question everything. So just because what I'm saying doesn't quite fit or with what you would like to believe, try and put your emotion to one side, guys, and pay attention to what scholarship agrees, because those guys know far more than me and probably far more than you, and they're the ones that I'm really kind of directing you towards or trying to summarize for you.
And for all the people who would push back on that and say it's an appeal to authority fallacy, I think there's a big difference between simply appealing to someone, as an authority in an area that's not their expertise, versus looking at the overwhelming consensus on a particular position based off of years of scrutiny. Doesn't mean that people don't get stuff wrong, but it's you're more likely to, it's a much safer bet if you're following where the expert opinion is leading. And sometimes there's minority opinions. It's history's complicated.
Very complicated. If I just wanted to appeal to authority, my articles would be very short. They would simply say, this is the consensus, full stop. And that would make for a pretty boring blog, but you know, that's how that would be an appeal to authority. What I'm doing is I'm saying why, and then I'm giving the reading. So if you don't believe me, you can go and read these guys. And if there are alternatives, and if there is a debate on a particular question, I try and make sure that I flag that, and I try to be even-handed in presenting that, particularly if I think that both of those positions are legitimate. But what I don't do is sort of say, well, all opinions are equal, because there are some opinions out there which are just completely batty, and there are some some very fringe ideas which I think are, and most scholars think are probably wrong. But yeah, no, I don't believe in appeals to authority at all. This is what I am doing, though, is gesturing towards expertise, which is different.
Yeah, and that's honestly why I started my channel in the first place. Is that, you know, both with yourself and with me, we don't want to just know what the truth is. We want to know why it's true. We want to be able to examine the evidence to understand how people reached a particular conclusion and put the pieces together. Even if we are not experts in an area ourselves, we can still explore, we can still learn. And as always, we should dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid.